The silence of the quiet suburban street was shattered by the sound of two sharp gunshots. For a few seconds, the world seemed to pause. No sirens, no screams, just an eerie stillness hanging in the night air. Then the frantic voice of a woman cut through the silence, trembling with panic as she spoke into the receiver. "Oh my God, she's down! She's not getting up!" The 911 dispatcher's voice remained calm, professional. "Ma'am, where are you? Can you tell me what happened?" "She was just there. And then, oh my God, I heard it. I saw someone running." A few blocks away, a patrol car's radio crackled to life. Officers on duty sprang into action, the sirens screaming as they sped through the quiet neighborhood. By the time they arrived, the garage was cast in the dull glow of a single overhead light. The metal frame of a white sedan gleamed under the fluorescence, parked neatly as if nothing was wrong. But there, just a few feet from the driver's side door, a woman lay sprawled on the concrete, a crimson pool slowly expanding around her head. One of the officers approached cautiously, hand instinctively resting on his holster. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response. Her chest wasn't rising. Her limbs were limp, lifeless. Another officer bent down, touching the side of her neck. A long, agonizing pause. Then he shook his head. "She's gone." The lead officer's jaw tightened. "We need to lock this scene down. Now." Yellow crime scene tape was quickly unfurled, stretching across the driveway, warning neighbors to stay back. The woman's face, now pale under the artificial light, was eerily serene. Her wide eyes still open, staring blankly at the ceiling as if she hadn't even seen death coming. A detective arrived moments later, stepping out of an unmarked car. His trench coat swayed slightly in the cold night air. As he approached, an officer briefed him. "Victim is female, early 30s, gunshot wound to the head. No sign of a struggle, no forced entry. It looks," he hesitated, "like an execution." The detective crouched near the body, scanning the scene. A handbag sat on the passenger seat of the car, untouched. The front door of the house remained locked. Whoever did this hadn't forced their way inside. They had been waiting for her. Another officer hurried over, his breath visible in the night air. "Sir, we have a witness, a neighbor across the street. She called it in." The detective nodded. "Bring her over." A woman in a bathrobe, still trembling, was led toward the scene. Her face was pale, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Tell me what you saw," the detective said gently. The neighbor's voice wavered. "I was watching TV when I heard the first shot. At first I thought maybe it was fireworks, but then I heard another, and I knew. I ran to the window and saw someone, some man, running toward a car parked at the end of the street. He jumped in, and they sped off." The detective's eyes sharpened. "Did you see his face?" She shook her head quickly. "No, it was too dark, but I saw his shape. Tall, wearing dark clothes. A shadow in the night, a faceless killer." The detective straightened. "Did you recognize the car?" The woman hesitated. "I think it was dark. Maybe black? I don't know the model, but I swear I've seen it before." That made his pulse quicken. "Seen it before? Where?" She swallowed hard. "Here, on this street, parked down the road, like it was watching." A chill settled over the detective's spine. This wasn't random. Someone had been waiting for this moment, studying her routine. This was calculated. He turned back to the body, the lifeless woman who had no idea she was being hunted. Her expression was frozen in time. Eyes wide, lips slightly parted, as if caught mid-thought. The question that hung in the air was no longer who had done this, but rather why. And how long had they been planning it? The morning light cast a pale glow over the crime scene as investigators worked in methodical silence. The once quiet suburban street had transformed into a chaotic blend of flashing lights, murmured voices, and the occasional snap of a camera, capturing the evidence that would later piece together the final moments of Robert Frata's life. By dawn, the body had been taken away, but the stain of violence remained. Neighbors gathered at a distance, whispering, their expressions a mixture of shock and unease. A mother of three had been murdered in cold blood, just feet away from the safety of her home. It was a crime that felt too brutal, too deliberate to be random. Inside the police station, The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the quiet hum of computers processing reports. The lead detective sifted through Farah's background, searching for a thread that would unravel the mystery of why someone had wanted her dead. The evidence at the scene had been minimal. No forced entry, no missing valuables, no clear signs of a robbery. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was planned. As he flipped through the pages of her case file, the picture of her life began to emerge. Farah Frata had been, by all accounts, a dedicated mother, a woman who adored her three children and worked tirelessly to build a future for them. Friends described her as kind, resilient, and intelligent. But beneath the surface, her life had been anything but peaceful. Her marriage had been troubled for years. Robert Frata, her estranged husband, was a former police officer, a man with a reputation that swung between charming and controlling. He was the kind of person who demanded respect, who thrived on control. In the early years of their marriage, he had been charismatic, even protective. But over time, that protectiveness had twisted into something far more dangerous. Farah had confided in close friends about his behavior. She had spoken of his temper, the way he would belittle her, the suffocating need he had to dictate every aspect of their lives. The divorce had been messy, a drawn-out battle over custody that had drained her emotionally and financially. She had fought to keep her children safe, fearing what might happen if they were left in his care for too long. As the detective dug deeper, another disturbing pattern emerged. Farah had been afraid. In the weeks leading up to her death, she had told those closest to her that something felt wrong. She had noticed cars parked near her home at odd hours, had received strange phone calls that would disconnect as soon as she answered. She had even expressed the chilling fear that someone was watching her. Yet despite her fears, there had been no formal reports filed, no restraining orders, no written threats that could be used as evidence. Just whispers between friends, a lingering dread she couldn't quite put into words. In one of her final conversations with a friend, she had said, "If anything ever happens to me, don't believe it was an accident." The detective leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This was no accident. It wasn't a crime of passion or a burglary gone wrong. It was an execution. Farah had known something was coming, but she hadn't known when, and now it was up to them to find out who had made sure she never got the chance to escape. The investigation into Farah Frata's murder had barely begun, but one truth was already clear. This was no random act of violence. A suburban mother of three did not simply fall victim to a late-night attack without reason. Someone had wanted her dead, and they had gone to great lengths to ensure it happened swiftly and without complication. By the time the sun rose over Atascocita, Texas, the crime scene had been meticulously processed. Investigators had combed through every inch of the driveway and garage, documenting the smallest details. The bullet casings had been carefully collected, the victim's car examined for any trace evidence, and the surrounding area checked for security cameras. But the crime itself had been chillingly efficient. No obvious fingerprints, no discarded weapon, no clear signs of a struggle. With no immediate forensic breakthroughs, detectives turned to the next step in any homicide case, examining the people in the victim's life. More often than not, murder was personal. The first place to look wasn't at faceless criminals lurking in the shadows, but at the relationships closest to the victim. Farah's ex-husband, Robert Frata, was the name that stood out immediately. Within hours of her death, officers arrived at his residence, a home noticeably devoid of grief. Frata did not react with shock or devastation. His demeanor was unsettlingly calm, his responses clipped and measured. When asked about his whereabouts the previous night, he stated he had been at home with his children. His alibi was corroborated by his own parents, who had been staying at the house. It was, on the surface, airtight. Yet there was something about Frata that made the lead detective uneasy. The way he spoke about Farah was detached, almost mechanical. He didn't ask who could have done this or express any desire for justice. Instead, his words carried an air of finality, as if the murder was merely an inconvenience rather than a personal tragedy. It wasn't just his demeanor that raised suspicion. The history between Robert and Farah Frata was no secret. Their marriage had been volatile, their divorce even more so. Friends and family had seen the strain, the way Farah had struggled to break free from his control. She had feared him, not just as an abusive husband, but as a man who thrived on dominance. Digging deeper into the custody battle, detectives uncovered court documents detailing Farah's repeated concerns about Robert's behavior. She had fought tirelessly to protect her children, even expressing to close friends that she believed he would do anything to win, no matter the cost. But if Robert Frata had orchestrated this, he had done so carefully. There was no direct evidence tying him to the crime, and with his alibi confirmed, law enforcement needed to look beyond the obvious suspect. Farah had been seeing someone new, a boyfriend, recently introduced into her life. Could jealousy have played a role? Investigators tracked him down, scrutinizing his whereabouts on the night of the murder. But there were no signs of hostility between them, no indication that he had anything to gain from her death. Was it a robbery gone wrong? That theory unraveled quickly. Nothing had been stolen, not from her car, not from her home, not even from her purse, which remained untouched on the passenger seat. Whoever had killed Farah had not been after money. The case, for all its obvious motivations, remained frustratingly elusive. A woman had been murdered execution style, yet the suspect with the strongest motive had an unshakable alibi. And then, a small but significant detail emerged. A witness, shaken and hesitant, came forward with a piece of information that changed the course of the investigation. They had seen a car, dark, unidentifiable in the dim streetlights, idling near the crime scene before the gunshots rang out. It hadn't just been there that night. The witness was certain they had seen it before. Somewhere hidden within the layers of deception was the answer. Farah Frata had been murdered with chilling precision, and if the investigators were right, the person responsible was still out there, watching, waiting, confident they had gotten away with it. The murder of Farah Frata had left detectives grasping for answers, but the shadows surrounding her death were beginning to thin. A witness had described seeing a dark-colored vehicle lingering near the crime scene, a car that had not just appeared that night, but had been spotted in the neighborhood before. It was a small detail, seemingly insignificant on its own, but in the intricate puzzle of a planned killing, no detail was too small to ignore. Investigators retraced their steps, combing through security footage from surrounding streets and local businesses. In cases like these, where the killer had been methodical, there was rarely an obvious mistake. But even the most calculated plans had weak spots, and it was the job of law enforcement to find them. After hours of reviewing grainy footage, a breakthrough emerged. A camera positioned at a nearby gas station had captured a vehicle matching the description given by the witness. It was parked at the far end of the lot, the driver's face obscured by the angle. But it was something. More importantly, a timestamp placed the car near the crime scene just minutes before the murder. A team of forensic experts examined the footage carefully, enhancing the image to pull out whatever details they could. The make of the car remained unclear, but its silhouette and movement pattern were enough to establish a connection. Someone had been waiting. Someone had been watching. At the same time, forensic teams had been processing the physical evidence from the crime scene. The 2 bullet casings recovered from the driveway were carefully analyzed. Firearms experts worked to identify the weapon, comparing the markings on the casings to those in national databases. It was a slow process, one that required patience, but it was one of the few tangible leads they had. The breakthrough, when it finally came, was chilling. The shell casings matched a specific caliber linked to a crime committed months earlier. A robbery in which a suspect had been apprehended, but later released due to lack of sufficient evidence. The connection was tenuous, but it introduced a new possibility. If the same gun had been used in both crimes, then whoever had access to that weapon might be the key to unlocking Farah's murder. Detectives widened their search, digging into known offenders with histories of violence or contract killings. The idea that Farah had been executed by a professional was no longer a distant theory. It was becoming a terrifying reality. As they continued to follow the trail of evidence, a chilling realization settled in. The murder of Farah Frata had not been spontaneous. It had not been the result of a random act of violence. It had been orchestrated, and whoever had pulled the strings had left just enough space between themselves and the crime to avoid suspicion. For now. The forensic match between the shell casings found at the crime scene and those from an earlier robbery had given investigators something they desperately needed: a direction. It was no longer a question of whether Farah Frata's murder had been planned, but who had been involved in executing it. The caliber of the weapon and its connection to a prior crime suggested that the killer was not an amateur. This was someone with experience, someone who understood how to carry out a hit without leaving an obvious trail. Detectives began the painstaking process of tracing the gun's history, following the chain of possession in hopes of uncovering the shooter. The robbery linked to the firearm had taken place months before in a different part of Houston, involving a suspect with a criminal record, Howard Guidry. He had been arrested in connection with the robbery, but later released due to insufficient evidence tying him directly to the crime. Now his name resurfaced, and this time, the stakes were much higher. Guidry was no stranger to law enforcement. He had spent years navigating Houston's criminal underworld, associating with figures involved in theft, drug trafficking, and violent offenses. He had the profile of someone who could be hired for a job like this: young, reckless, willing to take risks for the right price. But even if he had pulled the trigger, detectives knew that he was not the one calling the shots. Through surveillance records, financial transactions, and phone logs, law enforcement began piecing together a disturbing web of connections. A name started appearing alongside Guidry's: Joseph Price-Stash, an ex-con with a history of violent offenses. Unlike Guidry, Price-Stash was older, more methodical, and carried a reputation as a man who could make things happen in the criminal world. If Guidry had been the executioner, Price-Stash had likely been the middleman, the one who arranged the details, secured the weapon, and ensured the job was done right. But there was still one unanswered question: who had ordered the hit? As detectives dug deeper, their focus inevitably circled back to Robert Frata. His history with Farah, his obsession with control, his cold and indifferent reaction to her death. Everything pointed to motive. But Robert was careful. He had built an alibi that placed him away from the crime scene, and so far there was no direct evidence linking him to the murder. If he had orchestrated this, he had done so from a distance, making sure the plan unfolded without his direct involvement. Phone records became the next critical piece of the puzzle. Investigators traced calls between Frata, Price-Stash, and Guidry, forming a pattern that suggested communication in the days leading up to the murder. The timing was too precise to ignore. Conversations occurred at critical junctures: before the crime, immediately after, and again in the days following, as if loose ends were being tied up. With each new revelation, the picture became clearer. Robert Frata had not acted alone. He had set something in motion, trusting that the people he enlisted would ensure the job was carried out without leaving a trail back to him. But he had underestimated one thing: the determination of investigators to uncover the truth. Now, with a hitman identified and a middleman in the equation, the final pieces of the conspiracy were beginning to fall into place. Farah Frata had sensed that something was wrong in the weeks before her death. She had told friends she felt watched, that she knew danger was closing in. She had been right. And now detectives were closing in too. The walls were closing in. Every new lead, every piece of evidence, every phone record dragged the investigation further into the murky depths of a cold-blooded conspiracy. At the heart of it lay a simple but chilling question: who wanted Farah Frata dead badly enough to hire a killer? For months, detectives had painstakingly gathered fragments of the truth. They had followed the gun's trail to Howard Guidry, a known criminal with a reckless streak. The shell casings found at the crime scene linked him to a previous robbery. But a connection was not enough to secure a conviction. Law enforcement needed a confession, or someone willing to talk. Guidry, however, was no easy target. Despite his young age, he had learned the art of survival in the harsh world of Houston's criminal underbelly. He knew that words could be as dangerous as bullets, and he refused to offer more than silence. Yet even the most hardened criminals have weaknesses. Investigators turned to the details of his life, seeking pressure points. They knew that he had no real loyalty to anyone but himself. His criminal record painted a picture of a man who operated on the edges of violence and desperation, and it was desperation they intended to exploit. After days of relentless questioning, cracks began to form. Faced with the weight of the evidence and the promise of a lighter sentence, Guidry finally spoke. But his words did not reveal the full truth, only fragments of it. "I was just the trigger man," he insisted, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a flicker of fear. "I didn't plan it. I was told where to be and when to do it." Those few words confirmed what detectives already suspected. Farah's murder was not a spontaneous act of violence. It had been organized, carefully arranged by someone who wanted their hands clean while others did the dirty work. When pressed for the name of the mastermind, Guidry hesitated. Fear hung over him like a shadow. He knew that revealing the truth could mean signing his own death warrant. But there was another name he was willing to give, a name that investigators had already come across: Joseph Pristash. Pristash was no stranger to law enforcement. With a history of violent crimes and a reputation as an enforcer in Houston's criminal circles, he was the kind of man people feared. Cold, calculating, and methodical, he had the experience to orchestrate a murder for hire. And now Guidry had placed him squarely at the center of the plot. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Guidry had been the executioner. Pristash had been the middleman. But the question still burned. Who had given the order? With Pristash in their sights, detectives shifted their focus. They traced his movements in the weeks leading up to the murder. Phone records painted a damning picture. A pattern of communication between Pristash and someone who had the most to gain from Farah's death. The name at the other end of those calls was Robert Frata. It was a connection too obvious to ignore. Farah's estranged husband had always been the most logical suspect. He had the motive, a bitter custody battle that he seemed determined to win at any cost. He had the means, connections to men willing to do the unthinkable for the right price. And now, through the confessions of a hitman, the method was becoming clear. But Robert Frata was no fool. He had taken steps to insulate himself from the crime. There were no direct threats, no incriminating messages. Everything had been handled through intermediaries. Without a direct confession or physical evidence tying him to the murder, building a case against him would be an uphill battle. Yet the more investigators dug, the more damning the picture became. Witnesses came forward, sharing accounts of Frata's cold indifference in the wake of his wife's murder. Friends recalled chilling conversations where he spoke openly about wanting Farah gone. He described her as an obstacle, a problem that needed to be solved. A former acquaintance recounted a conversation in which Frata had expressed his frustration with the legal system. "The courts will never give me my kid," he had said, "not while she's still around." As detectives compiled this growing body of evidence, they knew that proving Frata's involvement would require patience and precision. They needed to dismantle the layers of lies and fear that protected him. And then, in a quiet interrogation room, a new twist emerged. Under increased pressure, Guidry's composure cracked. He revealed a chilling detail that brought everything into sharper focus. Pristash had not only coordinated the murder, he had delivered the message from Frata himself. "He said it was a job," Guidry murmured, his voice barely audible. "And the guy paying? He wanted her dead. He wanted her gone forever." It was the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for. The noose was tightening around Robert Frata. What had begun as a shadowy conspiracy was now unraveling under the weight of its own secrets. But the battle was far from over. In the world of hired guns and silent conspiracies, the truth is never simple. The deeper detectives dug, the clearer it became. This was not just about one man's obsession with control. It was about how far someone would go to destroy the person who stood in their way. The deeper the investigation went, the more one name kept resurfacing: Robert Frata. Behind every shadow, every move, and every lie, his presence lingered like a cold, undeniable truth. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. The detectives knew they were dealing with a man who believed himself untouchable. A man who had orchestrated a murder with chilling precision while ensuring his own hands remained clean. By now, the framework of the crime was becoming disturbingly clear. Howard Guidry was the trigger man, the one who had pulled the trigger that ended Farah's life. Joseph Pristash had been the middleman, the fixer who connected the pieces and ensured the job was done. But it was Robert Frata, the estranged husband with an obsessive need for control, who had set everything in motion. The question that remained was how to prove it. Investigators knew that Frata was careful. Every move he made was calculated. He had no direct contact with Gidry, and his instructions were passed through Pristash like a message through a chain. There were no fingerprints, no handwritten notes, only the weight of circumstantial evidence and the whispered truths shared by those already ensnared. To break this case wide open, they needed something concrete, something that could directly tie Frata to the murder-for-hire plot. Phone records became a critical focus. In the days leading up to the murder, there had been a flurry of calls between Frata and Pristash. The pattern was unmistakable. Conversations before the crime, more calls immediately after, and even in the weeks that followed, contact remained, as if the three men were ensuring that every loose end was tied. Yet Frata had been smart. None of the calls contained explicit instructions. The conversations were brief, too brief, and spoken in vague terms. He had insulated himself from direct culpability, confident that his careful planning would protect him from ever being linked to the crime. But arrogance is often the weak point in even the most meticulously crafted plans. Detectives began interviewing people from Frata's life, friends, colleagues, acquaintances. What emerged was a portrait of a man who did not hide his desires well. In private moments, he had spoken openly about his hatred for Farah. He described her not as the mother of his children, but as an obstacle standing in the way of his freedom. Divorce had not been enough. He wanted her permanently gone. At the gym where he worked out regularly, others remembered hearing him talk about wanting her dead. It wasn't the kind of statement someone makes in jest. His words were cold, deliberate, spoken with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was inevitable. One witness recounted hearing him say, "If she's dead, I get the kids." It's as simple as that. Bit by bit, a picture of his intent became clearer. This wasn't a man overwhelmed by anger in a single heated moment. This was premeditation. He had planned, he had waited, and he had used others to carry out his will. And while he had been careful not to leave a direct trail, his ego had betrayed him. The more he talked, the easier it became to unravel his intentions. Financial records revealed another crack in his facade. In the months leading up to the murder, there were subtle but telling transactions. Small sums of money were withdrawn in cash, amounts that might not attract attention on their own. But cross-referenced with the timeline of the murder and the communications between Frata and Pristash, these payments suggested something more sinister. Investigators believed these withdrawals were used to pay Pristash, who in turn arranged payment for Gidry. But the most damning evidence came from a surveillance operation that had gone unnoticed by Frata himself. Detectives had quietly monitored his movements after the murder, hoping he would make a mistake. What they found was chilling. On multiple occasions, he was seen meeting with Pristash in secluded locations, parking lots, empty roadsides, always out of earshot but never out of sight. Each meeting, though brief, added to the growing sense that there was unfinished business between the two men. The weight of the evidence was building, but still it wasn't enough. Without a direct admission or a clear command linking Frata to the hit, the case remained circumstantial. And Robert Frata, for all his arrogance, knew exactly how to dance on the edge of that line. It wasn't until detectives uncovered a chilling piece of communication, a recorded conversation, that the tide began to turn. Pristash, under increased scrutiny and pressure, had become careless. In a phone call traced to his residence, there was a reference to the payment being handled and a chilling remark. He got what he wanted. It wasn't a confession in the legal sense, but it was enough to break open the case. With every new thread, the web surrounding Robert Frata grew tighter. Investigators knew they were closing in on the puppet master, a man who believed he had orchestrated the perfect crime. But the walls he had built around himself were starting to crack, and beneath the surface lay a truth that could no longer remain hidden. The weight of the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Every fragment of evidence pointed in the same direction, toward Robert Frata. Yet despite the growing mountain of suspicion, he remained a free man, calm, controlled, as if he believed no one could touch him. But behind the scenes, the walls were closing in. The investigators knew that motive was the heart of any successful prosecution. Without it, even the most compelling circumstantial evidence could unravel under scrutiny. What drove a man to orchestrate the cold-blooded murder of the mother of his children? What could push him to cross a line so irreversible? The answer lay in Robert Frata's obsession with control. By all outward appearances, he seemed like an upstanding member of society, a former police officer, a father. But those who knew him intimately painted a far darker portrait. Frata's need to dominate extended beyond his professional life and into every aspect of his marriage. In the beginning, Farah had been captivated by his charm, but that charm soon revealed itself as a mask. Beneath it was a man who demanded absolute obedience. When Farah began asserting her independence, the cracks in their marriage deepened. She had endured years of emotional manipulation, comments designed to chip away at her confidence, decisions made without her input, and a constant undercurrent of control. But it was the custody battle that finally pushed Frata over the edge. In his eyes, Farah was not just a former spouse. She was an adversary who stood between him and what he believed was rightfully his, their 3 children. The courts had consistently favored her, recognizing the danger in leaving the children under his influence. This enraged him. He believed the legal system had betrayed him, stripping him of the authority he believed he deserved. Frata's obsession grew more intense after each legal setback. Friends recalled his increasing frustration, the way he spoke about Farah as if she were an object to be removed rather than a person. He saw her independence as defiance, and every court ruling that favored her only fueled his desire to regain control, at any cost. One former acquaintance revealed a chilling encounter. Over coffee, Frata had spoken in disturbingly casual terms about solutions to his custody problem. When pressed, he brushed it off as a joke, but there was an edge to his words, a calculated coldness that hinted at something far more sinister. It wasn't just about the children. To Frata, losing to Farah was an intolerable humiliation. He could not bear the thought that a woman, someone he had once controlled, could defy him and win. His ego demanded retribution. Detectives began to piece together a timeline that traced the escalation of his anger. Phone records and financial documents revealed a pattern of communication and cash withdrawals in the weeks leading up to Farah's murder. The timing was precise. Payments made shortly before critical meetings with Joseph Pristash and more immediately after the crime was carried out. A breakthrough came when investigators uncovered a forgotten insurance policy. Years earlier, Frata had taken out a substantial life insurance plan on Farah. Despite their divorce, the policy remained active. If Farah died, Frata stood to gain a significant payout. For investigators, this discovery was pivotal. Not only did it provide a financial motive, but it also painted a picture of premeditation stretching back years. As the noose tightened, Frata's confidence began to waver. Despite his outward arrogance, his actions suggested a man growing uneasy. Surveillance caught him checking his surroundings more often, meeting with Pristash under increasingly secretive conditions. He seemed to sense that the investigation was closing in, but he remained convinced that his careful planning had shielded him from real consequences. But the case against him was about to become impossible to deny. A recorded conversation emerged, one that would become the most damning evidence yet. It was a call between Pristash and an associate, and though the words were coded, their meaning was clear. Pristash discussed a job well done and a payment being finalized. But the most chilling part came when he referred to the client, without using Frata's name, but unmistakably describing him. He wanted her gone, Pristash had said, and now she's gone. It was the smoking gun investigators needed. Combined with Guidry's confession, the phone records, and the financial transactions, the case against Robert Frata was becoming airtight. He had hidden behind others to carry out his will, but now those layers of deception were crumbling. Still, there was one final piece needed, a way to shatter the illusion of Frata's invulnerability. Detectives returned to those closest to him, hoping to find someone willing to talk. Eventually, their persistence paid off. A former confidant, someone who had once been part of Frata's inner circle, came forward with a chilling admission. In the days before the murder, Frata had openly boasted that she wouldn't be a problem much longer. That statement, combined with everything else, provided the clarity investigators needed. This was no crime of passion. It was a deliberate, calculated act, one born from a man who could not tolerate losing control. And now that same arrogance was about to bring him down. With every new revelation, the picture of Robert Frata became clearer. A man obsessed with power, A man who viewed others as pawns to be used and discarded, and a man who believed he could get away with murder. But the walls were finally closing in, and this time, there would be no escape. The trial of Robert Frata was destined to capture national attention. It was not just another murder case. It was the story of a man who had once sworn to uphold the law, now accused of manipulating that very system to commit the ultimate crime. A former police officer turned puppet master, using others to eliminate the woman he viewed as an obstacle. The media descended on the courthouse, cameras flashing as the case promised a chilling glimpse into the mind of a man consumed by power and control. Prosecutors approached the case with methodical precision. They knew that beyond the gruesome details, they had to convince a jury of one undeniable truth. This was not a random act of violence. It was a carefully orchestrated murder for hire, planned and executed with chilling calculation. The evidence, they believed, painted an irrefutable picture. In the opening arguments, the prosecution laid bare their theory. Robert Frata, enraged by the custody battle and unwilling to accept any outcome where he did not maintain dominance, had sought to permanently remove Farah from his life. He had not acted impulsively or out of temporary anger. This was a plan crafted over months, involving careful coordination and a cold detachment from the woman he had once vowed to protect. The jury listened in rapt silence as the prosecution described a web of lies, secret meetings, and the exchange of money that led to Farah's death. The foundation of the prosecution's case rested on three pillars: the triggerman, the middleman, and the mastermind. Howard Guidry had pulled the trigger, Joseph Pristash had arranged the hit, but at the center of it all stood Robert Frata, the man who had set the entire plan in motion. Each piece of evidence was meticulously presented, building toward the undeniable conclusion that none of this could have happened without Frata's orders. Key witnesses took the stand, their testimony cutting through Frata's carefully crafted facade. Investigators recounted the trail of phone records, cash withdrawals, and clandestine meetings. One by one, the threads of Frata's scheme began to unravel. The surveillance evidence, showing his secretive meetings with Pristash, was laid bare before the jury, stripping away the illusion that he had no involvement. But the most damning testimony came from the people who had once been closest to him. Friends who had laughed at his offhand remarks now recognized them for what they were: warnings disguised as jokes. Gym acquaintances recalled conversations where Frata, with chilling nonchalance, spoke about wanting Farah gone. Each witness revealed another layer of his callousness, painting the portrait of a man who had not only desired his wife's death, but who had spoken about it openly, as though it were merely a logistical problem to be solved. Perhaps the most compelling moment came when the jury heard the recording. In the low hiss of the playback, Joseph Pristash's voice was unmistakable. "He wanted her gone," he said flatly, "and now she's gone." The weight of those words hung heavy in the courtroom, a spoken confirmation of Frata's ultimate intent. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence, the defense mounted an aggressive counterattack. Their strategy was clear: plant seeds of doubt. They argued that no direct physical evidence linked Robert Frata to the crime. There were no fingerprints, no written orders, no explicit admission of guilt. The defense painted Frata as an easy target, a man trapped by circumstantial evidence and the words of criminals seeking to save themselves. They portrayed him as a loving father, wronged by a biased legal system and desperate to remain part of his children's lives. Every conversation where he had expressed frustration or anger was reframed as the harmless venting of a man pushed to the edge by an unjust custody battle. The defense team questioned the credibility of the witnesses, suggesting that their memories had been tainted by media coverage and the pressure of law enforcement. But the prosecution had anticipated these arguments. With a steady hand, they dismantled the defense's narrative. They pointed to the timing of the phone calls, each one aligning perfectly with the moments before and after the murder. They highlighted the money trail, showing how cash had flowed from Frata to Pristash and eventually to Guidry. Most importantly, they underscored a truth that no amount of legal maneuvering could erase. Farah had lived in fear. She had told friends repeatedly and explicitly that if anything happened to her, Robert Frata would be responsible. The emotional core of the trial came when Farah's loved ones testified. Her family spoke through tears about the pain of losing her, about 3 children left motherless, about the life stolen from a woman who had fought so hard to protect her children. The jury could not ignore the human cost of Frata's cold-blooded plan. As the trial stretched on, Frata remained expressionless. He sat through the proceedings with a detached calm, as though the outcome was a foregone conclusion. But beneath that composure, cracks began to form. Observers noted the way his jaw tightened when the recordings were played, the slight flicker of his hands when the financial records were displayed. For the first time, Robert Frata seemed to sense that his control was slipping away. The closing arguments were delivered with the gravity the case deserved. The prosecution did not mince words. This was not a crime of passion, they told the jury. This was an execution, ordered by a man who believed he was above the law. They urged the jury to see past the defense's distractions and focus on the cold, hard facts. A woman was dead, and the man who wanted her dead had left a trail of evidence too damning to ignore. The defense, in their final plea, painted Frata as a scapegoat. They insisted there was no smoking gun, only the unreliable words of criminals eager to reduce their own sentences. They asked the jury to consider whether it was truly possible to convict a man without direct proof of his hand in the crime. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. For hours, the weight of justice hung heavy. Outside, the world watched, waiting for the verdict in a case that had exposed the darkest edges of human desire and the lengths one man would go to reclaim power. In the end, the truth was too overwhelming to deny. When the jury returned, their verdict echoed through the hushed courtroom. Guilty. All three men, Robert Frata, Joseph Pristash, and Howard Guidry, were convicted of capital murder. The sentence was clear and absolute: death. Robert Frata, the man who had believed himself untouchable, was led from the courtroom in shackles. For the first time, his composure cracked. The control he had so desperately clung to was gone. And for Farah, justice had finally been served. The verdict echoed through the courtroom with a chilling finality: guilty. For Robert Frata, the man who had once wielded power as a police officer and sought to control every aspect of his life, the illusion of invincibility shattered. No longer the cold, calculating mastermind, he was now just another condemned man, stripped of authority, shackled, and led from the courtroom toward a future he could no longer manipulate. The media seized upon the case, branding it as one of the most shocking murder-for-hire plots in modern history. The public was captivated not just by the brutality of the crime, but by the sheer arrogance that had driven Frata to believe he could erase his wife's existence without consequence. For many, his conviction felt like a victory for justice, a rare instance where a man who had hidden behind others to commit a crime was finally held accountable. But even after the verdict, the legal battle was far from over. For years, Frata fought against the death sentence, filing appeal after appeal. His legal team argued that the evidence against him was circumstantial. There were no fingerprints, no direct orders in writing, no surveillance placing him at the scene of the crime. They claimed the testimonies of Joseph Pristash and Howard Guidry were unreliable, criminals turning against each other to save their own lives. But each attempt to overturn the conviction was met with the same result. The courts, unmoved by Frata's pleas, upheld his death sentence at every turn. Even from behind prison walls, Frata clung to his arrogance. He refused to express remorse, refused to admit his role in Farah's death. Interviews and legal documents painted the picture of a man who viewed himself as a victim, wronged by the system, betrayed by those he had once trusted. To the very end, he denied his guilt, maintaining the same cold detachment he had shown in the courtroom. But the truth could not be erased. Farah's family, who had endured years of heartbreak, remained steadfast through the long, grueling process. For them, the fight was not just about seeking justice. It was about ensuring Farah's voice was heard. Her children, robbed of their mother and burdened by the shadow of their father's crime, carried the wounds of that night for the rest of their lives. No verdict, no execution could restore what was lost. As the years passed, the legal delays finally ran out. On January 10th, 2023, after nearly 3 decades of legal battles, Robert Frata was led into the execution chamber at the Texas State Penitentiary. The man who had once believed he could orchestrate the perfect crime and walk away unscathed now faced the final judgment he had so desperately tried to avoid. Even in his final moments, Frata remained defiant. He offered no apology, no admission of guilt. His final words echoed the same cold indifference that had defined his actions from the beginning, words devoid of remorse for the life he had destroyed. As the lethal injection coursed through his veins, the life of Robert Frata came to an end. Not with the power and control he had so desperately craved, but with the quiet, inevitable consequence of his own arrogance. Yet even as his chapter closed, the ripples of his crime endured. Farai's memory remained etched into the hearts of those who loved her, a woman who had fought for her children's safety until her final breath. Her death became a haunting reminder of how power and control, left unchecked, could drive a man to commit unthinkable acts. In the end, the echoes of shadows of betrayal stretched beyond the walls of the courtroom and the prison. It raised unsettling questions about the failures of the legal system to protect victims before it was too late, about the hidden dangers lurking behind seemingly ordinary lives, and about how many others had suffered in silence, their stories left untold. For those who survived, the shadow of Robert Frata's betrayal would never fully fade. But with his execution, one truth became undeniable. Justice, no matter how long delayed, had finally prevailed. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.